Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another Sunday sermon. I am Reverend Riff, your host this week and all the other weeks too. I hope everybody is having a great Sunday. It is WrestleMania Sunday, and I tell you, WrestleMania Saturday was pretty damn great. I was skeptical going into the show that it would be good. It was good. We had a good time last night. Yeah. So, we're here today to do our thing, to kick off this WrestleMania Sunday. And I thought, what better thing to talk about on WrestleMania Sunday than the first ever grudge match in the Bible? The first Hell in a Cell. First throwdown, the first feud. Of course, I'm referring to Cain and Abel. Not Cain and Taker, but Cain and Abel. And this story, I feel like this is another one, much like the garden story with Adam and Eve, that everybody knows, right? Everybody who has ever learned anything about the Bible, even if you haven't, if you're not even religious in any way, shape, or form, I feel like you know the Adam and Eve story, you know the Cain and Abel story. Those two stories, just everybody knows them, right? And the Cain and Abel story is often taught through the lens of murder is bad. You know, this is the story of the first recorded murder. Murder is bad. And so that's really the lens that it's taught through, and that's about as deep as people dig into it. Now, some people like to get into the theocracy of it and talk about why God preferred Abel's sacrifice over Cain's, but they don't actually explore what the author was saying there and what the author's point was. Instead, they explore it through a very simplified lens, which I think last week, I hope that I did a good job of driving home to you that you can't look at these stories as literal stories. You are absolutely missing the point of the author's work by doing that. Instead, you need to read them like classics and read them through a lens of that they're a parable, that there's some kind of story designed to teach a truth, as well as, again, it's so important to keep in mind why these were written down in the first place. The Hebrew people were leaving exile. They need to set up a government and a way. They need to set up a shared history that kind of explains the way they do things, explains their identity, who they are, why they do what they do, so that they can set up a successful, puppet government basically back home in Israel. And so they decide they're going to take all these stories that have been shared through their culture for many, many generations and write them down, come up with a codified, accepted narrative, and that narrative is going to help guide them forward. And what's really key here to keep in mind is these were Jewish stories for Jewish people. Nobody writing these stories down 25, 26, 2700 years ago in some cases, nobody thought that these were going to become these books that all of the world would read. They were written for a specific audience by specific authors with a specific agenda. And if you extrapolate them from that agenda, it doesn't make as much sense, and you start making logical leaps. The other thing that you can't do with them, that Christians so desperately love to do, is to take them and try to assign them, try to parallel them with the New Testament. As we've talked about, those two things were written so far apart from each other. They're not connected. And so when the people wrote the New Testament, especially the non-Pauline epistles, They were basically creating connections out of thin air. These were people who at that point had read these Old Testament works and were like, how do we make this line up so that it seems like there's a connection? Because, newsflash, there's no connection. This, it's terrible. But it is what it is. And people search for this connection and they search for this meaning, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense because there isn't a connection. One is a collection of stories the Jewish people used to form the basis of their shared culture. The other is a set of stories that the Romans put together to hijack said culture and try to water it down, borderline destroy it in the, in the service of creating a one world government that was easier to manage as they occupied these people's territory. Those are not the same thing. They're not even connected, except for Christians decided to slap them in one book and act like it's all the same shit. Got it? Just wanted to clear that up. So, as is our new format, or as our buddy Bale put it, our reading riffbo, we are going to take just a second and analyze the story before we read it. Then we're going to read the story in our handy dandy, amazing Robert Alter translation. Then we will take a few minutes, talk about what we read, and what context you should actually be reading it through, because the context that you've been given it in is almost assuredly wrong. So, let's jump in here and start with just a couple things. So yeah, it's a conflict as old as time, right? This is as old a conflict as there has ever been in mankind. Brother versus brother, right? That's true, but that's not really the point of this story at all. That's not the point of this story. A sibling rivalry is the method, the mechanism, if you will, the MacGuffin that drives the story. That is not at all what the author was really trying to drive home as being important. There's a whole bunch of other conflicts going on here that this is a proxy for. And if we analyze those conflicts, we actually get some very interesting story, some story mechanisms that tie in with the other stories. Because I don't know how much you've read the Bible, but the Adam and Eve story and then the Cain and Abel story are very interesting. And then those characters pretty much disappear. Nobody cares about them anymore. We move on to other stories, other people, and they become completely inconsequential to the narrative. They were just there at the beginning, kind of as a storytelling method to kick this off. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, that the Hebrew people, they were starting from scratch here. They were creating their new narrative about who they were. It makes sense that one of the key things that you did in classic literature was genealogies. You showed what time period you were in, and you created a narrative based on so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And oftentimes, the Old Testament shared universe. What's up, Zale? Yeah. And the idea behind them was to lend credence to the people that were in power. That is always what happens. The people that are in power write the histories, right? We all know that. History is written by the winners. Morning, Barry. So what they do is they would take these shared histories and be like, okay, this guy's in charge now. Let's trace him back and make it seem like he was always supposed to be in charge. And the authors of Genesis decided that they would start at the very beginning, like the creation of the earth. Why? They want you to feel that this is an all-encompassing history. And they want you to feel that they're telling you the whole story, that they're going back to the beginning of time and moving forward from there. And that's a really interesting technique And it makes sense to do it that way. It's just nonsense because obviously nobody knows what was going on at the beginning of time. We've been through all that. That's not the point. As we've discussed last week, the whole point of that first story was not to be an accurate historical analysis of the creation of the universe. It was a story about how jealousy and loneliness could lead to the destruction of humanity. It had nothing to fucking do with the actual creation myth. It was just there. That was just the medium. Again, that's the MacGuffin that drives our story. And this one this week, Cain and Abel, it's the same thing. It is not a story about the first murder. It's not a story about sibling rivalries. It's about a whole lot of other shit that uses those as the vehicle to tell that story. So, let's look at just a couple things before we read the story, shall we? It is the OG sibling rivalry. I'll give them that. Like, this is the one, right? This is whenever there's a conflict among siblings, somebody refers to, somebody will bring up Cain and Abel. Much like if there's ever an underdog and a favorite, people call it a David and Goliath story. Two brothers fighting, siblings fighting, oh, got a real Cain and Abel situation on our hands. Even though that's not the point of this story. Again, it's not a historical narrative, it's a fable. They're not telling you this to actually document the first time a murder occurred. Christians love to hang on that, but I'm going to show you why, if they really believe this was the first murder, that their response to every subsequent murder is pretty stupid. There are multiple lessons to be gleaned from this that aren't about murder or theocracy. Now, why do I throw theocracy in there? Well, because many modern-day Christians love to harp on the fact that God loved or didn't approve of Cain's sacrifice, but he approved of Abel's. And they point out that it's because Cain was worshiping God the wrong way. So they look at it as a validation of, if you don't worship God the right way, God will reject you. It's not the point of this story. It's not. It's all in the names. Just like last week, again, reading these books in their original translations, or at least understanding what the authors were going for. I used the illustration last week, and I'll use it again. If I were to write a police story, and I were to name one of my officers, Officer Hitler McTriggerfinger, you would get the impression that he was a racist, quick, tempered gun nut. That's the impression you would get by that name. The Bible authors did the same thing. Not because they want you to believe that there was a guy named Hitler McTriggerfinger who happened to be a police officer, but because they want you to understand the point that these are archetypes filling roles, and that you're not supposed to look at them as fleshed out individuals. You're supposed to look them you're supposed to look at them as caricatures. They're embodying all these ideals, and it's showing a clash of these ideals, and then the denouement tells you which ideals you're supposed to follow. As with the Garden Tale, the names of the characters offer insight, and they make the nature of the story clear, and that it is not a historical narrative. Can't stress that enough. This is not a historical narrative in any way, shape, or form. And recurring themes. Repetition is a key technique used by the authors. If a theme or idea is repeated, it's because the authors were trying to emphasize it. There are times when you read these stories where you will notice them say something and then they'll say it again. Or if you notice a theme between stories. Oh, the Kentucky State Police were using Hitler quotes in their training. Unfortunately, that's not surprising. It's just sad. But, so, that's a key thing here that I think we all have to keep in mind is that if the authors took the time to repeat something over and over and over again, or if there's a theme that keeps coming up, it's because that's the point. It's really important. We talked about the number 3 and how often the number 3 is an important number. I posit to you that there's the first 3 stories in the Bible, really the first 3 fully fleshed out stories in the Bible, all have a very similar theme. And that theme is that if you upset the order of things, if you don't follow the status quo, the way things are supposed to go, that you end up in exile. And that would be pretty poignant for people that were living in exile and coming out of it when these books were written. First story, Adam and Eve, right? They don't listen. They upset the natural order of things. Why? Because they try to be like God. They eat the fruit when he told them not to. They're not ready to be like God, but they eat the fruit. Try to be like God. What happens? Exile. And you get Cain and Abel. What happens at the end? Cain, exile. Then you get the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob sells the most expensive bowl of soup ever and then uses cosplay to steal Esau's blessing. What happens? He ends up exiled and then in the longest ever episode of Wife Swap. That's what happens when you upset the order of things. And that should be clear as day. That should make sense to everyone. You're writing these books as a guideline, as a shared history for everyone, as a way to formulate an identity and this is who we are and how we do shit. The author is pounding it home in the very first 3 stories. And you know how you end up in exile? You want to end up in exile? Fuck shit up. Don't follow the plan. We'll end up in exile again. That theme is being screamed at you by the author of this book. Authors, most likely. And yet, Christians choose to look at it like these are literal stories, to be pored over and obsess about the details, when if you obsess about the details, these stories make no fucking sense. Instead, they are quite clearly morality tales, with one central theme being, if you fuck up the order of things, if you try to usurp your position, if you try to raise above where you should be, there's going to be a problem, and we're going to get exiled. That's the fucking point here. That's the first point. I really wanted to drive that home because it kind of drives me nuts that people don't get that. So, we're going to start in Genesis chapter 4. And let's boogie. And the human knew Eve, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have got me a man with the Lord. That is an important quote. Now, we read there that Eve, that Adam, the human, knew Eve. And there's no real great way to translate that. You'd get canceled, probably, if you translate it the real correct way, because the term that they use to describe the sexual congress of Eve and Adam is very clearly a sexual possessive congress. And so there's really no great way to translate it. He knew her is as good as anything, but yeah. And she bore as well his brother Abel. And Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought forth the fruit of the soil, an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you incensed? Why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well, or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you it's longing, but you will rule over it. That little segment has confused the shit out of scholars for years. It's believed to have basically been some kind of poem that would have been known to the people at the time, using, some kind of idea that sin is crouching at the tent flap, but you will rule over it. Basically, God is hinting at Cain, look, dude, you're sad. And when you're sad and when you're upset, bad things they're hanging around. You have to rule over them. Don't let those bad things in. And of course, Cain fails miserably at that. And Cain said to Abel his brother, let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And so, cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take from your brother's blood from your hand. It's a pretty intense fucking line right there. Well, we talked about it last week. On this one, we're going to cut him some slack. Again, God's giving him a chance to confess. Just like God knew Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and he gave them a chance to come clean, God's also giving Cain the chance here to fess up. But I love that line. The soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. Like, that is graphic. Instead, it's entrapment. If you till the soil, it will no longer give you its strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Now that you have driven me this day from the soil, and I must hide from your presence, I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, so that whoever found him would not slay him. And Cain went out from the Lord's presence and dwelled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And then he became the builder of a city, and called the city, like his son's name, Enoch. And Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad begat Mehulah, and Mehulah begot Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech, and Lamech took 2 wives, and bore one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Adah bore Jabal, and he was the first of the tent dwellers with livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the first of all to play the lyre and pipe. And as for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged every tool of copper and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah, and Lamech said this to his wives, Adah and Zillah, O hearken my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. For a man I have slain for my wound, a boy for my bruising. For sevenfold Cain is avenged, and Lamech 77. And Adam again knew his wife, and she bore him a son, and called his name Seth, as to say, God has granted me other seed in place of Abel, for Cain has killed him. And for Seth, too, him was a son born, and he called his name Enosh, and then that was the name that the Lord first invoked. That's a whole lot of shit. There's a whole lot of shit going on there. So let's break that story down a little more now. So, Cain and Abel are born to Adam and Eve. And Cain is a tiller of the soil. He's a farmer. Abel is a herdsman. Abel tends to the flock. Do you know what one of the longest running rivalries in the history of humankind is? It's of farmers versus shepherds. This is a conflict that goes all the way back. This is far bigger than Cain and Abel being brothers. This is Cain and Abel taking 2 different paths. Cain is staying at home, he's urbanized, he's tilling the fields, he's growing food, whereas Abel has adopted the more traditional lifestyle of he's attempted, the truest, most common job of the time. He's a shepherd. That's what you did back then. Being a farmer, it's a little different. It's a newer position in the job hierarchy at the time, and it's not really it's not really loved. It's not something that they're into. It's not looked at as well. What happens? God rejects the sacrifice. God likes Abel's sacrifice, and he doesn't like Cain's. Now, I have met so many Christians that will tell you that, well, yeah, because Abel did it right, and he sacrificed a lamb. God only likes abattoir valentines. God doesn't want a fruit salad. God wants blood. And, well, you could understand that as being what you know. Here's a little news flash for you. At what point in the story does God ever tell them which one he prefers? Remember, we're way ahead of God telling Abraham to split the animals in half and all that nonsense. We are way ahead of the laws of Moses. We're way before any of that. So how would Cain have any idea that he wasn't supposed to do what he did? Cain, it says, took the fruit, the things that he grew, the things that he created by his hard work. He took a portion of that and offered it up to God as a sacrifice. Same thing that Abel did. Now, I will say the author does make a slight distinction that Abel, it kind of hints that Abel brought the choicest shit from his flock. And it doesn't make that same modifier about Cain's. It doesn't say that he brought the absolute best grains and whatnot. It never really clarifies if that's what God's beef is. That, it's not about the fact that he wanted something to bleed as much as, that maybe Cain didn't bring the absolute best of his crop. But that's not explicitly stated. But we could kind of conjecture that might have been part of it. But again, what did I say at the beginning? This is a Jewish story written for Jewish people. Jewish people would have absolutely understood the implication of Cain's doing it wrong. God requires a blood sacrifice. Slaughtering some fruit and grains, busting some grapes, is not going to appease God. He wants, lamb cutlets for his sacrifice. If you want lamb, fruit salad is not going to cut it. But see, here's the thing. Again, there's no way that Cain could have known that. And we kind of get a hint at that at God's reaction. What does God say to him? God doesn't say, Cain, you fucking idiot, I wanted you to kill something, not, smash a watermelon on my altar. Don't go Gallagher, dickhead. That's not what God said. Instead, God goes, why are you so glum? What's the matter? What are you mad about? Almost as if God, while he favored Abel's offering, wasn't necessarily shitting on Cain's. He just is like, dude, this isn't quite what I want. But really, there's no need to be so glum. Why are you so down? Turn that frown upside down, Cain. That is essentially what God says to him. Cain responds by murdering the shit out of Abel. A bit of an overreaction, probably. What's also, I think, an interesting feature of this story is, where does Cain do it? Cain takes Abel out into the field. He takes him out into his area. Why are you so mad? He takes Cain out into his area. He takes him out into the field. Doesn't say they went onto the pastures. That would have been Abel's turf. No, he takes Abel goes onto Cain's home field, and Cain slaughters him. And then, what happens that's really interesting? We hear that God tells Cain that the very soil that you work, that provides you with your sustenance, your life's work, it's crying out to me. It's screaming for vengeance, like a shitty Judas Priest song, because it really, it's illustrating that he's broken the sacred bond. And I think it's also important to emphasize here, what was Adam's curse, right? Adam was cursed with having to work the soil, that it would be hard, and that shit wasn't just going to grow. He was going to have to go out and plant and grow things. And so it almost makes sense for Cain to sacrifice that, because that was the curse put on them, was that the shit wasn't just going to grow out of the ground. Cain was going to have to go out there and break his back tilling the soil and planting the seeds and all of that. And Cain does all that. So Cain endures the curse that his father brought upon him and takes the fruit of that labor and offers it to God. And God tells him that's not good enough. But there's no reason to be mad about it. Because God is, I think there's the implication here that God is somewhat proud of Cain. That's not the sacrifice he wants. And again, the Jewish audience would have completely understood that. The Jewish audience would have understood. It would have been implied that that's why God didn't accept it. But again, from the text of the story, Bible writers hated farmers. Absolutely. We're going to get to that. Bible writers hated farmers. And so the Genesis writer, I should say. The Genesis writer for sure hated farmers. And Cain was just trying to, I feel like, pay some of the debt that his father had put upon him. And Abel was doing the same, except for Abel was using God's creation to atone for his mistakes, much like the Jewish people believe the blood of the lamb that they sacrifice washes away their sins. Again, these are all things that would have made perfect sense to a Jewish reader of the time. Not things that would make sense to crazy people who read them thousands of years later and it wasn't their history. So let's look at these names, because these names are super important here. Let's start with Cain, alright? Big Daddy Cain. Why is Cain's name important? Well, I'm glad you asked. The name is a pun. In the previous verse, Eve says, "I have got me a man with the Lord." She uses the verbs kana and Cain. Those verbs mean I have got, or I am getting. And so, to create. And so basically she's saying, I have got, and God created a kid for me. Which is basically Eve participating in the act of creation. Remember where Adam named all the animals? Eve is the one who names Cain here. She is participating in this act of creation. Notice she doesn't say, I've got me a man with my man Adam. She says, I've got me a man with the Lord. She has basically removed Adam from this situation. This is her kid with the Creator. She's not really interested in Adam's input on this situation. Cain literally means smith, which of course is hilarious that the first supposed guy born, his name is Smith. Come on, that's funny. And it means someone who makes. She made him. His name means he is a maker. And God's been cucking dude since the beginning. I mean, there's really no other way to look at it. And his descendant, Tubal Cain, is mentioned later as the very first ever blacksmith. He's the metal worker. So Cain, I think it's kind of funny that his name literally means he's a maker. He's someone who makes things. But yet, what is he? He's actually a farmer. What does he do? He makes the crops grow, I guess. And you get Abel. Good, sweet Abel. His name is a bit convoluted, because while there is no clear etymology to it that anyone can really ascertain, historians, for the most part, agree that it's a play on the Hebrew word havel, which means a puff of air or a vapor. And so it's referring to his incredibly short lifespan. That Abel is just here. Now, how the fuck would his mom have known that when he was born, right? Again, further kind of evidence that these characters were not written to be real characters. You're not supposed to believe these are real people. It's a story. the one who makes murder on the guy who he was just here for a brief, a whiff. And they're archetypes for very distinct rivalries. Cain represents the expected privilege of the firstborn, as well as farmers. Abel represents the secondary children, as well as herdsmen, the eternal enemy of the farmer. I mean, as long as there have been farmers and herdsmen, they have been at odds with each other because they're competing for resources. They're competing for a way of life. And the author of this book is very clearly favoring the wandering herdsman over the farmer. And that is not something that's going to stop here. It keeps going and going and going. But let's look a little deeper into that. Let's look at the aftermath of this whole story. Because we know what happens, right? God doesn't like Cain's offering, so Cain kills Abel because of that. We get that. The land of Nod. This is one of the greatest areas of confusion in Bible history. Nod essentially means wanderer. And if you read that text, it said that Cain went off to the land of Nod for his exile, and he got married. He took a wife. Where the fuck did this chick come from? There's no mention in the story of any other women. So where did Cain get this wife? Christians have wrestled with how to explain this shit away forever. There's two options here. One is that the garden story never explicitly stated that Adam and Eve were the only people that El created. Barry, we're gonna touch on that. The garden story never explicitly states that Adam and Eve were the only people created by El. At no point in the story does it say El never tried this again. One theory that I kind of enjoy is that El has tried this more than once, and every time it fails, and he kicks these motherfuckers out. And so these ones, the land of Nod, these wanderers who live east of Eden, they're all the people that failed the test before Adam and Eve. The other option makes even more sense. It's that this story was intended as a fable, so the author was completely unconcerned with narrative consistency. It's just supposed to be a fable. Why are you worried about where the other woman came from? It's not important where the woman comes from. The point was the story about the conflict. And that, again, jealousy. Continuity errors. Because there's jealousy. Again, just like the first story. In the first story, what happened? Eve, the snake, exploited Eve's jealousy of Adam's relationship with God. And that jealousy led to their downfall. In this story, what happens again? Cain is upset over Abel's relationship with God. He is jealous. And so that jealousy leads to murder. And what does the murder lead to? Exile. Just like in the first one, the jealousy led to disobedience, which led to what? Exile. There is a theme here, and the theme is exile, not historical narratives. But we need to talk about something, because this is fun. So, Christians, this is obviously one of the biggest triggers for them. This one is always really hard for them. Where did Cain's wife come from? Because if you can't explain that, the whole idea of this as a historic text doesn't make any sense. If Adam and Eve were the first man and woman, and they're supposedly the only people on Earth, where the hell does this chick that Cain marries and starts to have kids with, we get 7 generations of Cain's kids listed out, how the hell does that happen? Well, Christian apologists have really outdone themselves on this one. Buckle up, kids. This is fun. So Christian apologists state, this is like the official Christian position on this nonsense, is that Cain, it mentions Cain and Abel, and the way the text mentions them, you're led to believe that they're pretty close in age. But many Christians will tell you that there's nothing there that says they were actually close in age, and that they could have been spread apart by a great number of years, and that Eve was popping out kids in between the two. There's a later verse in Genesis that states that Adam had 33 sons in total and 20-some daughters. If you see where this is going and it's gross, you're right. So the idea with many Christians is that Cain married either his sister or his niece, who was one of his other sister's daughters with one of his other brothers. And that the Bible claims that Adam lived for 800 years. That Adam and Eve were apparently just cranking out kids. Yeah, Eve's poor body, you're a kid. And that these kids were then cohabitating and creating more kids who were creating more kids. I will say, this level of incest explains why the Mormon Church thought that Eden was in rural Missouri. That part adds up for me now. But how could you have this level of incest without breeding the most Quasimodo deformed motherfuckers ever? Well, it's quite simple. According to Christian apologists, Adam and Eve had magic DNA. They had magic DNA that did not degrade despite intermingling with itself over and over and over again. And that it was only when there were enough people to diversify this gene pool that then God created the anti-incest laws. Christians love to point out that God doesn't forbid incest until Leviticus. So basically, in Genesis and Exodus, it's all fair game. I'm going to disagree with that hard. And here's why. The whole point of the Israelite texts is to differentiate themselves. They love to point out how they are not the fucking same as the other people around them. That the Hebrews are a different people. They are monotheistic. They're quite literally grandfathered in. Ugh. That they are different, right? Well, who were one of their OG oppressors? The Egyptians. What were the Egyptians super into? Inbreeding. Super into it. We've all heard about King Tut. Well, I find it very hard to believe that, and this, it's repeatedly stated throughout Scripture how disgusting the Hebrew people find inbreeding. They don't dig it. They're very anti-inbreeding. So it seems really funny that for something that is so anathema to them, the rest of the book, that they would choose their origin story to be based on that. Furthermore, if that was the case, why don't we get a name? We don't get a name for Cain's wife. Wouldn't the author have said, and then Cain married his sister so-and-so, or his niece so-and-so, or, Cain married his brother so-and-so's daughter so-and-so. The author never mentions that. Instead, the author describes her like she is just some wandering chick from out in the desert. A plot point that is not important enough to name because she's off in Nod. She's not one of these important people to the main story. She's just a device to give Cain descendants. And that is one of the many reasons that I think is nonsense to try to believe that magic DNA and all this other shit is why that's where Cain's wife came from. Instead of the far more plausible, again, that this is just a story and that none of this happened, so the author was not concerned with narrative consistency, or that, there's other people doing experiments with people. That El made some other people and they're running about. But he's focused on Adam and Eve. These, remember, our theory from the first week that Adam and Eve were never supposed to spend eternity as people. They were supposed to become gods, like El, and they fucked it up. Maybe El had already made people, but they weren't creating what he wanted. So instead, he made these two other people in his likeness and was going to raise them up to be gods like him, to be peers. But they fucked up, so he just sent them out there with all the other assholes. And Cain fucks up even more, so he has to go live with the assholes among the assholes, the wanderers. I think that's far more likely than magic DNA and the most incestuous thing since the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So let's get back to this now. There is an anti-urban bias. It is real clear. Cain, the first recorded murderer, is also the first person to found a city, according to the text. In the Hebrew implication, when you read it, it basically says the father of murder is also the father of cities. You add in God rejecting the farmer's offering, and the implication is really strong here that God hates... They hate farming in cities. Yeah, they hate sedentary lifestyle. They hate this idea of... You keep in mind, most of the Old Testament does not go well for the Israelites. The majority of the text, they are getting their ass kicked and sent into exile, being attacked or oppressed by either the fucking dragon that they've been following around in the desert, or, the god that they build, this magical communication device with, and then he gets angry a lot when they light incense incorrectly. The one time that the Israeli people are portrayed... the one time that you see that the really people thriving in these books is Abraham. Abraham is super thriving when he is just managing his flocks and just kind of doing his thing, living with his clan. And he's just making bank. What happens now? Let's look at some other examples here to see this anti-urban bias, if you will. Look at the story of Abraham and Lot. Everything's great. They are rich beyond measure. They are freaking Jeff Bezos rich. And then all of a sudden Lot goes, I'm going to go live in the city. Of course, that city was Sodom and Gomorrah. And what is the implication there? That everything goes wrong when he goes to the city. And if he would have just stayed in the country with Abraham, shit would have been fine. You look at Nineveh. Every time the city of Nineveh, which is one of the greatest cities in the world at the time, is mentioned in the Bible, it is mentioned in an ultra negative thing, that the people are wicked there. Babylon is always mentioned in a negative light. Rome, always mentioned in a negative light. When the story of Noah, before the flood, what does it say? The men from the cities were wicked. It is over and over and over again in this book that living in the city will make you evil. Living around other people in close quarters like that, not living in the traditional herding, kind of nomadic Bedouin lifestyle that they had lived for so many years. By rejecting that lifestyle, you were inviting disaster. That is hammered home here, and people just seem to overlook it. Why? Because the guys who were writing this were headed back, and they wanted to resume the lifestyle that their forefathers had lived, where you basically a clan-oriented lifestyle, and all of these clans would be loosely united under the idea of being the Hebrew people. But you stayed with your people. You stayed with your clan. When you went to the city and you started intermixing with everybody, that's when disaster struck. That's when things got bad. So this is why Republicans like the Bible so much. I'm convinced of it, is the very clear, reminiscing about the good old days, before we lived in cities and all these kids were hanging out with people that were different than them. The xenophobia that rural people exhibit towards urban people, that has literally been alive for millennia. Millennia. It is as old as the Bible. Now, there are some continuing themes that I think are important to look at here. Exile, as we said. In the first few chapters of Genesis, we have two stories that both end in exile. And given the time that these were written, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, as I pointed out earlier, the very next story ends in exile. When Jacob steals Esau's blessing through an incredible set of cosplay, he's forced into exile. And then he plays the dating game to the weirdest game. Right, if they exile people, they go move to the cities. And we all know how that gets bad. But then again, think of that. So then what are cities? They're collections of exiles. They're collections of the dregs, right? All the bad people live in the city. Why? Because they've been kicked out of their clans where the decent folk live. Further driving the narrative that cities are cesspools full of bad people. Undeserved mercy. Christians love to miss this part of the story. In the garden, El promised death for eating the fruit, but he didn't kill Adam and Eve. He exiled them. Murder was always punished with a death sentence, especially fratricide. He killed his brother. That is so taboo in the Bible. I mean, in any society, killing your brother is bad, right? But it is really, really taboo. Yet, El doesn't kill him. He doesn't kill him. Instead, he actually protects him. This is something that I feel like a lot of people miss the point on. They talk about the mark of Cain. You've all heard of the mark of Cain, right? We've all heard of the mark of Cain. But yet, what is the mark of Cain? Nobody knows. It's not specific. But Christians look at it as this negative thing. Oh, the mark of Cain. The mark of Cain was basically a protection spell. Because God flat out put it out there, if you lay a finger on this dude, 7 times will that come back on you. Your next 7 generations will be cursed if you touch this guy. So if anything, God is protecting the murderer. He exiles him, but he does not kill him. And in fact, he says nobody else will kill you either. That's, a whole lot of forgiveness for a murderer that perhaps people who love the death penalty so much should consider. Again, if you're supposed to be godlike, right? That's the whole point of Christianity. Here we are, people have not listened to God under pain of death twice here, and both times he didn't pull the trigger. I mean, he makes up for it the rest of the book, but in this one, he seems awfully understanding, right? This is another reason that I think El and Yahweh are different. Because Yahweh would have fucking roasted these guys. El is a little more understanding. Family ties. Adam's punishment was based on the fact that he should have been responsible for Eve, and he failed her. Remember, that is what God was more mad about with Adam, was that he should have kept Eve from eating the fruit to begin with. Eve was his charge. Similarly, Cain, an older brother, should have been taking care of his younger brother. The fact that his younger brother had passed him in God's eyes, and his response was to brutally murder him for it, that's it's a big deal at the time. And it also, I feel like there's something interesting here that we can look at too, as this is another story. There's a string of 3 stories almost in a row here in the Bible where the younger brother passes. You just got an ad for State of Unreal. There's a pattern here again. 3 stories almost in a row. We get Cain and Abel. The younger brother is who God's favorite is. What happens? Murder. Second story, Jacob. He is overly ambitious and he seeks to steal his brother's place in the family. What happens? Exile, really weird dating scenario. And then the third story, Joseph. He gets the Dapper Dan treatment from his dad, and that drip causes his brothers to use human trafficking to send him, what are we talking about? Into exile. So, once again, what's happening? The natural order of things is not being respected. The older brother is supposed to be the one who, moves along, moves the family forward. And every time that gets upset and the younger brother oversteps his bounds, usurps his place, you end up in exile. What you can read here is a very clear theme from the authors of Genesis. Don't fuck with the system. Don't step out of line. Follow the status quo, or we're going to end up in exile again. Because what was the point of these books, remember? The point of these books was to codify a shared culture and behavioral pattern so that they could not end up in exile again. Remember, these are being written right before, during, and shortly after they were released from a generation's worth of exile. They're just getting to go home. And so they just got home. What are they going to pound into everybody's heads? Do not fuck about. We do not want to end up in exile again. Don't go being an upstart. Don't go trying to change things. Why? Because what's going to happen here? They're going to elect somebody a ruler. And the last thing they need is somebody saying, well, I don't like him as the ruler. I want to be the ruler. They're like, no. If you do that, shit will end poorly. The fucking Persians will come back here. We will end up in exile again. So we have to follow the rules. We have to follow the plan. That should be crystal clear to anyone reading these stories. These are not historical tales. They're fables that very clearly illustrate that jealousy makes you do bad things. Loneliness is a bad thing. Family ties are important, but that in a family you have to respect the hierarchy. That's what's important. And that is what the author of these stories was trying to get across. Only people who this was not their history have hijacked this. One little more note on Cain's wife before we go. Again, I said, and it was very clearly stated, that nowhere in the Old Testament, nowhere in Genesis, does it ever mention that El didn't make anybody else. It doesn't say that Cain, or that Adam and Eve were the only people he ever made. Christians love to say that's not true in 1 Corinthians. Paul. So we're bringing a guy who wrote something a solid 600 years later into this. And again, that's what Christians have to do to try to sell you on the Adam and Eve are the father of all mankind, because Paul said so. What the fuck does Paul know? Was Paul there when they wrote this shit? Was Paul there at the beginning? No. Fuck Paul. Fuck Paul the liar. Fuck Paul with a hammer. We hate Paul. So I really think it's important to keep that in mind. Christians can't defend this as a creation myth without referencing unrelated texts. When you stick to the regular text, all my homies hate Paul. Everybody hates that dickhead. Team James over here. But yeah, when you stick to the text, it's painfully obvious that these are just fables designed to help begin the building of a nation and a way of life. And that nation and way of life's number one concern is don't fuck with the system. Follow the rules or exile. It's always exile. Follow the rules or exile. That's the key. That's what it's all about. And it's pretty simple if you just read the goddamn book. So that's all I'm saying. So thank you very much for being here this week. I hope you learned something about the Cain and Abel story that maybe you didn't know before. I hope you look at it in a different way and realize that it's actually a great story about herdsmen versus farmers and anti-urban bias, which is probably why Republicans love it so much. Although it doesn't end in the death penalty, which I don't know how they square. So, what are you going to do? I hope everybody has a great rest of their Sunday. I am looking forward to WrestleMania again this evening. I'm a big dork, and I had fun last night. So, thank you for being here, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday. And remember, don't be like Cain. Turn that frown upside down. And if God likes someone better than you, that's okay. You should totally not murder them over it. Take care, everybody. Have a great Sunday.